The winter of 1944 was the darkest hour for the French resistance in the Amiens region. For years, a secret army of ordinary people, school teachers, farmers, railway workers, and housewives, had been fighting a shadow war under the noses of their German occupiers. They were the eyes and ears of the Allies, smuggling downed airmen to safety, blowing up train tracks, and passing secrets that would save thousands of lives. Their commander was a man known only by his code name, Dominique. But in early February, that shadow war crashed into the light. A simple, brutal mistake. A new resistance courier, nervous at a checkpoint, gave a password that was 1 day out of date. The German Gestapo, the secret police, were waiting. They followed him. For 48 terrible hours, the Gestapo rolled up the entire Amiens network. One arrest led to another. Safe houses were raided. Hidden radios were seized. Secret lists of names were found. By February 18th, over 100 members of the resistance were crammed into the cold, stone cells of Amiens prison. Among them was Dominique. The Germans knew they had captured the head of the snake. They also knew the value of what they held. This wasn't just a group of troublemakers. This was the entire intelligence and sabotage network for northern France. And the Gestapo had a simple, effective method for dealing with such prizes. The Nacht und Nebel decree, night and fog. Prisoners would vanish without a trace, executed in secret, their families never knowing their fate. But one piece of paper, one critical slip, changed everything. In their hurry, a German clerk typed up the prisoner list for transfer. And he made a terrible error. He included the execution date, February 19th, 1944. 9 a.m. This list did not stay secret. A French nurse working at the prison who secretly supported the resistance saw it. She copied the date. She passed it through a trusted contact. Within hours, this devastating news was in the hands of what was left of the network outside the prison walls. They sent a frantic, coded message across the English Channel to London. Top men captured. Stop. Execution set for dawn February 19th. Stop. Request immediate action. Stop. The message landed on the desk of a British Air Force officer, Group Captain Charles Pickard. He was a legend, a man famous for low-level precision bombing. He knew what this meant. A normal bombing raid on a prison would kill everyone inside, the very people they needed to save. A ground assault was impossible. The prison was deep in occupied territory, surrounded by German barracks. But Pickard had a weapon no one else did. The de Havilland Mosquito. It was called the Wooden Wonder, a bomber made of plywood, fast as a fighter, able to fly so low it could blow the leaves off the trees. And its pilots were the best of the best, men who could drop a bomb through a specific window. Pickard proposed the impossible. Use mosquitoes flying at rooftop height to blow holes in the prison walls without collapsing the buildings. Blow the locks off the doors. Blow the gates off their hinges. Create chaos so the prisoners could run, while the guards were stunned. It was a surgical strike of incredible danger. The mosquitoes would have to fly hundreds of miles at low level in broad daylight to hit a small target surrounded by anti-aircraft guns. One small mistake and they would kill everyone they came to save. In London, the decision went to the very top. Winston Churchill himself was asked. He listened to the plan. He looked at the execution order. He knew the value of the French resistance. He also knew the risk of a terrible public disaster. After a long silence, he gave just one word of authorization. Proceed. Back in Amiens, the prisoners knew none of this. In his cell, Dominique could only wait and hope his message had gotten through. Around him, men and women prepared to die with dignity. They shared what little food they had. They wrote final letters on scraps of paper, knowing they might never be sent. They listened to the bells of the city marking the hours, each chime bringing them closer to the morning and the firing squad. And in the cold English dawn of February 18th, Group Captain Pickard stood before his hand-picked pilots. He didn't give a grand speech. He simply laid out the facts. They were not going to destroy a factory or a bridge. They were going to try to break a prison wall. Their bombs had to be precise. Their timing had to be perfect. The margin for error was zero. The lives of over 100 people, and the future of the resistance in France depended on their skill. As the Mosquito engines coughed to life, the greatest jailbreak in Air Force history, codenamed Operation Jericho, was beginning. Its success or failure would be measured not in rubble, but in the number of souls who walked out of the gates of hell, back into the light of a free morning. The plan was simple on paper: blow holes in the prison walls so the prisoners could escape. But in reality, it was a nightmare puzzle. How do you use 500-pound bombs, weapons designed to level buildings, to carefully unlock a building instead of destroying it? Group Captain Charles Pickard and his planners gathered in a secret room in London, staring at maps, blueprints, and scale models of Amiens Prison. The prison wasn't just one building. It was a fortress. A massive, 3-story main building made of thick stone and concrete, shaped like a giant X, with a central guard tower. Around it was a towering outer wall 20 feet high and 3 feet thick. Inside that wall were courtyards, guard posts, and barbed wire. And inside the main building, in cells along the outer walls, were the prisoners. The problem was physics. A standard bomb, dropped from high altitude, would plunge through the prison roof and explode deep inside, collapsing the whole structure and killing everyone. That was the exact opposite of their goal. That's when one of the engineers, a quiet man who had studied architecture before the war, pointed at the model. "We don't bomb the prison," he said. "We bomb the walls around the prison." He explained a revolutionary idea: low-level, delayed action bombing. The Mosquito bombers would fly so low, at barely rooftop height, that they couldn't miss. They wouldn't drop their bombs in an arc. They would place them like a deliverman dropping off a package. They would aim not for the cell blocks, but for the base of the thick outer walls and the main prison gates. The bombs themselves were the second part of the trick. They would use special 11-second delayed fuses. Normally, a bomb explodes the instant it hits something, but these fuses had a tiny clock inside. When the bomb hit the base of the wall, it would bury itself in the dirt or punch partly into the stone, and then wait for 11 long seconds. This pause was the key to the entire miracle. Here's why: in those 11 seconds, the Mosquito plane would be far past the target, safe from its own explosion. The bomb would be sitting still, deep against the foundation. When it finally exploded, all of its tremendous force would go outwards and upwards, not inwards. It wouldn't blow down into the ground or sideways into the prison. It would act like a giant can opener, punching a hole upward through the massive wall. The explosion would rip a gap in the stone, creating an opening for people to run through. If done perfectly, the shock wave would travel up the wall and away from the prison buildings, shaking them but not collapsing them. But the planning got even more precise. The pilots were given 3 specific targets, each with a different job. Target 1, the outer wall. The first wave of Mosquitoes would bomb the northeast corner of the huge outer wall. Their job was to create the main escape route, a giant hole leading from the prison courtyard to the fields and city beyond. Target 2, the prison gates. The second wave would hit the main guardhouse and the heavy iron gates at the prison entrance. This wasn't just to make another hole. It was a trick. The Germans would expect an attack to come from the outside in. By blowing the gates inward, the bombers would create confusion. The guards would think Allied soldiers were storming the front door, drawing their attention and gunfire away from the real escape hole in the back wall. Target 3, the X building walls. The third and most dangerous wave had the hardest job. They had to fly directly at the long walls of the main prison building itself, the walls that had the prisoners' cells inside. They couldn't bomb the cells. Instead, they were to aim for the base of these walls down at ground level. The idea was that the upward blast from their delayed bombs would blow the locks and hinges clean off the heavy cell doors from the outside, popping them open like a soda can, while the stone wall above absorbed the shock. The timing had to be perfect. The entire attack would last less than 5 minutes. Each 3-plane wave would attack in a line, one after the other, so the bombs would hit in a precise row. If one wave was late or one pilot dropped his bomb early, the whole plan could fail. A bomb exploding a few seconds early could destroy the plane behind it. A bomb landing just a few feet off target could collapse a wing of the prison. The pilots trained for 2 frantic days. They flew over similar buildings in England, practicing their approach at just 50 feet off the ground, so low they could see people looking up at them from windows. They practiced dropping dummy bombs on lines painted on fields, learning the exact moment to release. They memorized the prison layout until they could see it with their eyes closed. The night before the raid, Group Captain Pickard gathered his men. He told them the truth. This isn't about destruction. It's about precision. We are not demolishing a target. We are performing surgery. Your bombs are the scalpel. If you are precise, we give them a chance. If you are not, we become their executioners. The mission's success now rested on three impossible things: the skill of the pilots flying at treetop level, the reliability of a tiny 11-second clock inside each bomb, and the hope that the laws of physics would send the force of the explosions out instead of in. They were trying to use the tools of absolute destruction to perform an act of liberation. No one had ever tried anything like it before. And as the Mosquitoes took off into the cold dawn of February 18, 1944, no one knew if it would work, or if it would become one of the war's most tragic failures. As the first Mosquito bombers lifted off from their English airfield in the gray pre-dawn of February 18th, the pilots felt a cautious hope. The sky was cold and clear. The forecast for the French coast was good. For a mission that demanded perfect visibility, where flying lower than a church steeple was the plan, the weather was their first and most important ally. But the English Channel had other ideas. About halfway across the water, the world began to change. A wall of cloud, thick and dark, appeared on the horizon. It wasn't just a cloud layer. It was a full winter storm, rolling in from the Atlantic much faster than anyone had predicted. Within minutes, the clear sky was gone. The Mosquitoes were swallowed whole. Inside the cramped cockpits, the pilots stared into a world of white and gray. The clouds closed around them like a wet blanket. Visibility dropped to zero. They couldn't see the plane next to them. They couldn't see the water below them. They were flying blind, guided only by their instruments, the humming dials and glowing needles of the artificial horizon and altimeter. This was a disaster. Their entire plan was built on seeing the ground. They needed to spot roads, rivers, and church steeples to navigate. They needed to fly at 50 feet, the height of a 4-story building, to place their bombs with surgeon-like precision. You cannot fly at 50 feet in a cloud. One small error, one misreading of the altimeter, and they would fly directly into a hill, a tree, or the cold, dark water of the channel. The mission commander, Group Captain Charles Pickard, flying in the lead Mosquito, faced an impossible choice. He could order the mission aborted, turn everyone around, go home, and tell London that the rescue had failed before it began. That would mean leaving the resistance fighters to their execution at dawn. Or he could press on, gambling that the storm would break before they reached the French coast, gambling 19 aircraft and 38 lives on a hope. He made the call. Over the crackling radio, he gave the order, "Descend. We go under it." It was a terrifying decision. To escape the blinding cloud, they had to go down. But how far down? Below the clouds there could be clear air, or there could be more cloud right down to the waves. They had to find a gap, a hole in the weather without hitting the water. Slowly, carefully, the formation of Mosquitoes began to descend. The pilots' eyes glued to their altimeters, watching the needles spin down. 1,000 feet, 500 feet, 200 feet. At 100 feet, they were still in the soup. The gray mist streaked across their windshields. 70 feet, 50 feet. Then, at barely 30 feet above the churning sea, they broke out. They were now flying in a narrow slice of clear air, sandwiched between a solid ceiling of cloud above and the white-capped waves below. The cloud base was so low it felt like they could reach up and touch it. This was their new reality. A bombing raid would now be flown in a tunnel, with a storm for a roof and the ocean for a floor. The storm wasn't just visual. It was a physical beast. Turbulent wind slammed into the light wooden planes, tossing them like toys. Icing began to form on the wings, a deadly white frost that added weight and ruined the careful aerodynamics of the Mosquito. The pilots fought their controls, muscles aching, just to keep the aircraft level. Navigation became a desperate guess. They could no longer follow their planned land landmarks. They had to rely on dead reckoning, pointing the nose in the general direction of France and praying the wind hadn't pushed them miles off course. For over an hour they flew like this, 38 men in a roaring, shaking, wooden box, skimming the waves, watching the fuel gauges drop, and wondering if they were even headed in the right direction. The stress was immense. This low, with this weather, a single engine failure meant instant death. There was no altitude to glide, no time to react. Then, through the spray and mist, a darker shadow appeared. The French coastline. They had found it, but they were dangerously off course. They were south of where they needed to be. Now they had to turn and fly north along the enemy coast, just feet above the beaches, to find their starting point for the final run inland to Amiens. Every mile was a risk of being spotted by a German coastal radar or a sharp-eyed soldier. They finally reached the River Somme, their planned guide inland. But here, the weather offered one final, cruel trick. As they turned to follow the river valley toward Amiens, they ran into a blinding snow squall. One moment they could see the ground. The next, the world dissolved into a swirling, white chaos. Snowflakes blasted horizontally across their windshields, thicker than any cloud. They were literally flying into a white wall. In the lead plane, Pickard had seconds to decide. They were minutes from the target. They could pull up, climb above the storm, and become visible to every German anti-aircraft gun for miles. Or they could push through, flying totally blind at ground level. He chose to push through. He dropped even lower, his wingtips seeming to brush the frozen fields, using the dark line of the river as a ghostly guide in the whiteout. For the pilots behind him, it was a leap of faith. They could no longer see the ground. They could no longer see the lead plane. They could only trust their instruments, their training, and the voice of their commander on the radio, counting down the distance to the target. They were now flying one of the most precision-dependent missions in history, completely blind, in a blizzard, at the height of a house, into the heart of enemy territory. The weather gamble had become a full-blown race against a white nightmare, where the finish line was a prison wall they couldn't even see. The snow squall that had swallowed the Mosquito bombers broke apart as suddenly as it had begun. One moment, the pilots were flying blind in a white fury. The next, the prison at Amiens appeared directly ahead, rising from the flat, snow-dusted fields like a stone monster. They had found their target. But they had no time for relief. The clock was ticking. It was 12:01 p.m. Inside the prison, the morning had been a slow agony. The condemned resistance fighters heard the distant air raid sirens, but paid little mind. Bombers passed over Amiens often. They huddled in their cold cells, writing final letters, praying, waiting for the guards to come for them. None could have imagined that the planes screaming toward them at rooftop height were their salvation. In the lead Mosquito, Group Captain Charles Pickard saw the prison's distinctive X-shaped layout. He took a deep breath. The outer wall looked impossibly thick. The cell blocks looked terrifyingly close together. The plan that had seemed so clever on paper now felt like a terrifyingly dangerous gamble. He keyed his radio. Target in sight. First wave, attack. The first wave, the outer wall. 3 Mosquitoes, led by squadron leader Ian McCritchie, peeled off to the right. They dropped so low that people in the streets of Amiens later swore they saw the pilots' faces. They were aiming for the base of the northeastern outer wall. One after another, they raced across the prison yard. At the last possible second, each pilot pressed the bomb release. The first 500-pound bomb struck the ancient stones and buried itself. The second hit just 5 feet away. The third another 5 feet from that. The Mosquitoes roared past, climbing steeply to avoid the coming blast. Inside the prison, the guards and prisoners heard only a series of heavy thumps as the bombs embedded themselves in the foundation. Then, the 11-second fuses did their work. Whomp, whomp, whomp. 3 enormous, upward-ripping explosions erupted at the base of the wall. It wasn't a single, fiery blast like in the movies. It was a deep, volcanic roar. The ground itself seemed to lift. A section of the 20-foot-high wall, thick enough to stop a tank, didn't just crack. It disintegrated. Stone blocks the size of cars were tossed into the air like children's toys. A massive cloud of dust, smoke, and debris mushroomed upward, and when it began to clear, there was a yawning, jagged hole over 30 feet wide. The first escape route was open. The second wave, the gates. Before the dust could settle, the second wave of 3 mosquitoes, led by Pickard himself, screamed in from the south. Their target, the main guardhouse and the heavy iron front gates. This was the diversion. As their bombs struck the gatehouse, a spectacular secondary explosion erupted. They had hit the Germans' own ammunition store. A fireball climbed into the sky. The iron gates were blown completely off their hinges, flying inward into the courtyard. Just as planned, the German guards panicked. With the gates blown in and a fire raging at the entrance, they believed they were under a ground assault. They scrambled toward the front of the prison, rifles ready, shouting commands, their attention completely diverted from the back wall and the prisoners. The third wave, the cell blocks, seconds from disaster. Now came the most dangerous moment. The third wave of mosquitoes, led by Flight Lieutenant Tony Wickham, lined up for their run. Their job was the hardest. Fly directly at the long walls of the main prison building, the walls that held the cells, and drop bombs so precisely they would blow the cell doors open without bringing the roof down on the prisoners. Wickham pushed his mosquito even lower, until he was flying below the level of the prison roof. He was so close he could see the barred windows flash past. He lined up on the long east-facing wall, his finger hovering over the release. He had to be perfect. A bomb hitting even 10 feet off target could plunge into a cell block and kill dozens. He pressed the button. His 2 wingmen did the same. But something went wrong. One bomb, dropped a fraction of a second late, didn't hit the base of the wall. It sailed just a few feet higher. It smashed through the wall above the foundation line and exploded inside the ground floor corridor of the prison itself. The effect was catastrophic, but not in the way anyone feared. The 11-second delay meant the bomb didn't explode on impact. It skidded and tumbled into the central guard corridor before detonating. The blast was contained inside the prison's shell. It did not collapse the building. Instead, it acted like a massive concussive hammer blow to the entire structure. Every cell door on the ground floor, solid wood and iron, was blasted clean off its hinges by the shockwave. Doors flew inward, clattering onto the cell floors. At the same instant, the explosion killed or stunned almost every German guard in that central corridor. For a second, there was stunned silence in the cells. Then, the prisoners understood. This wasn't an attack on them. It was an attack for them. The way was open. A voice, then many voices, began shouting, "Out! Get out! Go!" A torrent of men and women, many in tattered civilian clothes, some bleeding from cuts caused by flying debris, poured from their cells into the smoky corridor. They didn't need instructions. They saw daylight streaming from the huge hole in the outer wall. They saw the chaos at the front gate. They ran, stumbling over rubble and fallen doors, toward the gaping opening in the world. The timing was so precise it felt choreographed. The wall was open. The guards were distracted or dead. The cell doors were blown open. And the prisoners were moving. In less than 60 seconds from the first bomb blast, the first escapees were scrambling through the broken outer wall, disappearing into the back streets and snowy fields of Amiens, free men and women against all odds. The mosquito pilots, climbing away and looking back, saw tiny figures streaming from the hole in the wall like ants from a crushed nest. They saw no secondary explosions from collapsed buildings. They saw the diversionary fire burning at the front gate. Against all probability, against terrible weather and impossible odds, the surgery had worked. They had used bombs not to destroy, but to unlock. And in that moment, they knew the gamble had paid off. The jailbreak was on. Chaos is a language all its own. And in the courtyard of Amiens Prison at 12:03 p.m. on February 18, 1944, chaos was shouting. The roar of the explosions had been replaced by a new symphony. The screams of wounded guards, the crackle of flames from the blasted gatehouse, the hysterical shouts of German soldiers, and beneath it all, a new sound, the thunder of desperate, running feet. The first prisoners who stumbled from their blown-open cells into the smoky corridor couldn't believe their eyes. Where there should have been guards with machine guns, there was only rubble and dust. Where there should have been a locked, impenetrable wall, there was a jagged doorway of daylight, 30 feet wide, leading to open fields. For a heartbeat, they froze. Was this a trick? A trap? Then instinct, the raw, primal will to live, took over. They ran. It started as a trickle. A few brave souls sprinted for the hole, slipping on broken stone. Then it became a flood. Men and women, some still in shackles, others barefoot, poured from the cell blocks. They were teachers, railway workers, farmers, housewives. Hours before, they had been preparing to die. Now they were scrambling for their lives. They didn't run as an organized army. They ran as 258 individual explosions of hope. The German guards were in complete disarray. The plan had worked perfectly. The diversion at the main gate had done its job. Most of the guards had rushed to the front of the prison, convinced they were about to be stormed by British commandos. They were firing their rifles at shadows in the smoke, shouting to reinforce the main entrance. By the time they realized the real escape was happening at the back wall, it was too late. The prisoners were already vanishing into the city. But escape was only the first battle. Now came the test of the resistance network itself. This was the moment their secret organization had to work. Outside the prison walls, the ordinary citizens of Amiens became heroes. They had heard the bombs. They had seen the low-flying mosquitoes. And many knew exactly what it meant. As the first prisoners stumbled into the snowy streets, bleeding and confused, doors opened. Not every door, that would be too suspicious. But certain doors on certain streets prearranged as safe points. A shopkeeper pulled a bleeding man into his back room. A grandmother ushered two shivering women into her cellar and threw a rug over the trapdoor. A teenage boy on a bicycle acted as a scout, pedaling ahead of running prisoners, whistling a warning if a German patrol was coming around the next corner. The city itself became a living, breathing escape route. Some prisoners didn't hide. They kept running, fueled by pure adrenaline. They jumped fences, waded through icy streams, and cut across frozen farmland. They knew the countryside from their secret work, which farm had a sympathetic owner, which hayloft was safe to hide in until dark. The landscape they had used for sabotage now became their sanctuary. The most important escapee was the man known as Dominique, the resistance leader. He didn't run for the nearest house. He moved with purpose. He was recognized by others, and a protective circle formed around him as they ran. He was the brains of the entire network. If he was recaptured, the mission was a failure. Within minutes, he was whisked into a waiting delivery van, its back filled with empty vegetable crates. It drove slowly, calmly, away from the prison district, just another truck making deliveries in a city under siege. Back at the prison, the scene was one of surreal devastation and German fury. The guards finally regained some control, sealing off the area. But the birds had already flown. They rounded up the prisoners who were too wounded or too stunned to run, about 180 of the original 400-plus inmates. But the prize catches, the resistance leaders, were gone. The guards could only stare at the unbelievable hole in their wall and the trail of footprints in the snow leading to freedom. The mosquito bombers were already miles away, racing back to the English Channel at low level. In their cockpits, the pilots were silent, processing what they had seen. They couldn't know the exact numbers, but they had seen the tiny figures fleeing. They had done it. They had used 500-pound bombs not to take lives, but to give them back. As the adrenaline faded for the escapees, a new reality set in. They were free, but they were not safe. They were in an occupied city, with their pictures likely on Gestapo walls. They were wet, cold, and many were injured. But they were alive. In attics, cellars, and barns all around Amiens, 258 people who had expected to be dead by morning were now drinking water, binding wounds, and whispering their thanks. They had been given a second chance, delivered not by an army on the ground, but by a handful of pilots in wooden planes who had gambled everything on a single perfect strike. The jailbreak was a stunning, chaotic success, but the final cost was still being counted. And for the men who had flown the mission, the flight home would bring its own terrible price. The mosquito bombers returned to England as heroes, but their celebration was quiet and haunted. They had done the impossible, but the cost had been written in smoke across the French sky. 2 of their planes never came home. Group Captain Charles Pickard, the mission leader, and his navigator were shot down by a German fighter while making one final, brave pass over the prison to photograph the damage. They died in a field not far from the walls they had just broken open. Another Mosquito, badly damaged by ground fire, crashed into the English Channel on the return flight. The jailbreak of 258 people had cost the lives of 7 airmen. The news in London was a mix of triumph and sorrow. Winston Churchill received the report. The raid was a stunning tactical success. The core of the Amiens resistance was saved. But the price had been high. Churchill called it a brilliant act of daring, paid for in the bravest blood. For the people of Amiens, the aftermath was brutal. In the days that followed, the Germans launched a furious manhunt. Over 100 of the escaped prisoners were recaptured. Many were shot on sight. The Gestapo's revenge was swift and terrible. But the most important leaders, including Dominique, remained free. The heart of the network continued to beat. Within weeks, they were back at work, their operations saved, their intelligence once again flowing to the Allies. The mission had achieved its vital, secret goal. But the true legacy of Operation Jericho wasn't just in the lives saved that day. It was written in the history of air warfare itself. Before February 18, 1944, no one believed you could use heavy bombers as precision surgical tools. Bombers were for carpet bombing, for flattening cities, factories, and rail yards from miles high in the sky. The idea that you could fly a bomber so low that you could choose which wall to blow up and which wall to leave standing was thought to be a fantasy. Jericho proved it wasn't a fantasy. It was a new kind of warfare. The raid became the textbook example, the blueprint, for what we now call precision low-altitude bombing. The techniques learned that day, flying at rooftop height using delayed action fuses, coordinating multiple waves of attackers with split-second timing, changed everything. Just a few months later, those same techniques were used in an even more famous raid, the Dam Busters. The men who flew that mission studied Jericho's after-action reports. They used the same low-flying approach. They even used a similar, though more advanced, skip bombing technique to bounce their bombs into the dams. The ghost of the Amiens raid flew with them over the Ruhr Valley. Later in the war, when the Allies needed to destroy a specific Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen without flattening the school next door, they used the Jericho model. When they needed to bomb a prison in France to free more resistance fighters, they looked back to Jericho. It became the first chapter in a new manual of air power. But perhaps the most powerful legacy is a human one, written not in military reports, but in memory. For decades after the war, the survivors of Amiens prison and the families of the airmen who died had no contact. They lived in separate worlds, connected only by a few minutes of thunder on a winter's day. That changed in the 1990s. A French historian began to piece together the full story. He tracked down the aging resistance survivors. He found the relatives of the lost RAF crew. He organized a reunion in Amiens, at the prison, which still stood with scars on its walls. An elderly Frenchman, who had been a young teacher in cell 14, stood before the plaque commemorating the raid. Beside him stood the niece of Group Captain Charles Pickard, the pilot who had died to save him. The Frenchman took her hand. He placed it on the cold stone of the prison wall, on the exact spot where the bombs had blown the hole. "No one had ever tried such a thing before," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They were told it was impossible. But for us, in our cells, the impossible arrived at noon. It had 2 engines, it was made of wood, and it gave us back our lives." Today, a simple stone memorial stands outside the old prison. It lists the names of the 7 airmen who died, and it bears an inscription in both French and English. "In grateful memory of the airmen of the Royal Air Force who gave their lives to shatter the prison walls and set their brothers free." Operation Jericho proved that in war, courage can be measured not just in destruction, but in precision. Not just in taking ground, but in giving freedom. It showed that an airplane could be more than a weapon, it could be a key. And its legacy echoes every time a modern pilot, guided by lasers and computers, places a single bomb through a single window to avoid civilian casualties. That idea, the idea of a surgical strike, took its first, daring breath over the snowy fields of Amiens, when wooden wonders and brave men decided that some walls deserved to fall, and some lives were worth every impossible risk.